Section 11 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 3, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 11. The Avenger, Part 4, by Thomas de Quincey. He sank under the torture and the degradation. I, too, thoughtlessly, but by a natural movement of filial indignation, suffered the truth to escape me in conversing with my mother. And she—but I will preserve the regular succession of things. My father died, but he had taken such measures, in concert with me, that his enemies should never benefit by his property. Meantime, my mother and sisters had closed my father's eyes, had attended his remains to the grave, and in every act connected with this last sad rite had met with insults and degradations too mighty for human patience. My mother now became incapable of self-command. In the fury of her righteous grief, publicly and in court denounced the conduct of the magistracy, taxed some of them with the vilest proposals to herself, taxed them as a body with having used instruments of torture upon my father, and finally accused them of collusion with the French military oppressors of the district. This last was a charge under which they quailed, for by that time the French had made themselves odious to all who retained a spark of patriotic feeling. My heart sank within me when I looked up at the bench, this tribunal of tyrants, all purple or livid with rage, when I looked at them alternately and at my noble mother with her weeping daughters, these so powerless, those so basely vindictive, and locally so omnipotent. Willingly I would have sacrificed all my wealth for a simple permission to quit this infernal city with my poor female relations safe and undishonored. But far other were the intentions of that incensed magistracy. My mother was arrested, charged with some offense equal to petty treason, or scandalum magnatum, or the sowing of sedition, and, though what she said was true, where, alas, was she to look for evidence? Here was seen the want of gentlemen. Gentlemen, had they been even equally tyrannical, would have recoiled with shame from taking vengeance on the woman. And what a vengeance! O heavenly powers, that I should live to mention such a thing! Man that is born of woman, to inflict upon woman personal scourging on the bare back, and through the streets at noonday! Even for Christian women the punishment was severe with the laws assigned to the offense in question. But for Jewesses, by one of the ancient laws against that persecuted people, far heavier and more degrading punishments were annexed to almost every offense. What else could be looked for in a city which welcomed its Jewish guests by valuing them at its gates as brute beasts? Sentence was passed, and the punishment was to be inflicted on 2 separate days, with an interval between each, doubtless to prolong the tortures of mind, but under a vile pretense of alleviating the physical torture. 3 days after would come the first day of punishment. My mother spent the time in reading her native scriptures. She spent it in prayer and in musing, while her daughters clung and wept around her day and night, grovelling on the ground at the feet of any people in authority that entered their mother's cell. That same interval, how was it passed by me? Now mark, my friend, every man in office, or that could be presumed to bear the slightest influence, every wife, mother, sister, daughter of such men I besieged morning, noon, and night. I wearied them with my supplications. I humbled myself to the dust. I, the haughtiest of God's creatures, knelt and prayed to them for the sake of my mother. I besought them that I might undergo the punishment 10 times over in her stead, and once or twice I did obtain the encouragement of a few natural tears, given more, however, as I was told, to my piety than to my mother's deserts. But rarely was I heard out with patience, and from some houses repelled with personal indignities. The day came. I saw my mother half undressed by the base officials. I heard the prison gates expand. I heard the trumpets of the magistracy sound. She had warned me what to do. I had warned myself. Would I sacrifice a retribution sacred and comprehensive for the momentary triumph over an individual? If not, let me forbear to look out of doors, for I felt that in the self-same moment in which I saw the dog of an executioner raise his accursed hand against my mother, swifter than the lightning would my dagger search his heart. When I heard the roar of the cruel mob, I paused, endured, forbore. I stole out by by-lanes of the city from my poor exhausted sisters, whom I left sleeping in each other's innocent arms, into the forest. There I listened to the shouting populace. There even I fancied that I could trace my poor mother's route by the course of the triumphant cries. There, even then I made, O silent forest, thou heardst me when I made a vow that I have kept too faithfully. Mother, thou art avenged. Sleep, daughter of Jerusalem, for at length the oppressor sleeps with thee. And thy poor son has paid, in discharge of his vow, the forfeit of his own happiness, of a paradise opening upon earth, of a heart as innocent as thine, and a face as fair. I returned and found my mother returned. She slept by starts, but she was feverish and agitated, and when she awoke and first saw me she blushed, as if I could think that real degradation had settled upon her. Then it was that I told her of my vow. Her eyes were lambent with fierce light for a moment, but when I went on more eagerly to speak of my hopes and projects, she called me to her, kissed me, and whispered, "Oh, not so, my son. Think not of me. Think not of vengeance. Think only of poor Berenice and Marianne." Aye, that thought was startling. Yet this magnanimous and forbearing mother, as I knew by the report of our one faithful female servant, had, in the morning, during her bitter trial, behaved as might have become a daughter of Judas Maccabeus. She had looked serenely upon the vile mob, and awed even them by her serenity. She had disdained to utter a shriek when the cruel lash fell upon her fair skin. There is a point that makes the triumph over natural feelings of pain easy or not easy, the degree in which we count upon the sympathy of the bystanders. My mother had it not in the beginning, but long before the end, her celestial beauty, the divinity of injured innocence, the pleading of common womanhood in the minds of the lowest class, and the reaction of manly feeling in the men, had worked a great change in the mob. Some began now to threaten those who had been active in insulting her. The silence of awe and respect succeeded to noise and uproar, and feelings which they scarcely understood mastered the rude rabble as they witnessed more and more the patient fortitude of the sufferer. Menaces began to rise toward the executioner. Things wore such an aspect that the magistrates put a sudden end to the scene. That day we received permission to go home to our poor house in the Jewish quarter. I know not whether you are learned enough in Jewish usages to be aware that, in every Jewish house, where all traditions are kept up, there is one room consecrated to confusion, a room always locked up and sequestered from vulgar use, except on occasions of memorable affliction, where everything is purposely in disorder, broken, shattered, mutilated, to typify, by symbols appalling to the eye, the desolation which has so long trampled on Jerusalem, and the ravages of the boar within the vineyards of Judea. My mother, as a Hebrew princess, maintained all traditional customs. Even in this wretched suburb she had her chamber of desolation. There it was that I and my sisters heard her last words. The rest of her sentence was to be carried into effect within a week. She, meantime, had disdained to utter any word of fear, but that energy of self-control had made the suffering but the more bitter. Fever and dreadful agitation had succeeded. Her dreams showed sufficiently to us, who watched her couch, that terror for the future mingled with a sense of degradation for the past. Nature asserted her rights, but the more she shrank from the suffering, the more did she proclaim how severe it had been, and consequently how noble the self-conquest. Yet, as her weakness increased, so did her terror, until I besought her to take comfort, assuring her that, in case any attempt should be made to force her out again to public exposure, I would kill the man who came to execute the order, that we would all die together, and there would be a common end to her injuries and her fears. She was reassured by what I told her of my belief that no future attempt would be made upon her. She slept more tranquilly, but her fever increased, and slowly she slept away into the everlasting sleep which knows of no tomorrow. Here came a crisis in my fate. Should I stay and attempt to protect my sisters? But, alas, what power had I to do so among our enemies? Rachel and I consulted, and many a scheme we planned. Even while we consulted, and the very night after my mother had been committed to the Jewish burying ground, came an officer, bearing an order for me to repair to Vienna. Some officer in the French army, having watched the transaction respecting my parents, was filled with shame and grief. He wrote a statement of the whole to an Austrian officer of rank, my father's friend, who obtained from the emperor an order, claiming me as a page of his own, and an officer in the household service. O heavens, what a neglect that it did not include my sisters! However, the next best thing was that I should use my influence at the imperial court to get them passed to Vienna. This I did, to the utmost of my power. But 7 months elapsed before I saw the emperor. If my applications ever met his eye, he might readily suppose that your city, my friend, was as safe a place as another for my sisters. Nor did I myself know all its dangers. At length, with the emperor's leave of absence, I returned. And what did I find? 8 months had passed, and the faithful Rachel had died. The poor sisters, clinging together, but now utterly bereft of friends, knew not which way to turn. In this abandonment they fell into the insidious hands of the ruffian jailer. My eldest sister, Berenice, the stateliest and noblest of beauties, had attracted this ruffian's admiration while she was in the prison with her mother. And when I returned to your city, armed with the imperial passports for all, I found that Berenice had died in the villain's custody, nor could I obtain anything beyond a legal certificate of her death. And finally, the blooming, laughing Marianne. She also had died, and of affliction for the loss of her sister. You, my friend, had been absent upon your travels during the calamitous history I have recited. You had seen neither my father nor my mother, but you came in time to take under your protection, from the abhorred wretch the jailer, my little broken-hearted Marianne. And when sometimes you fancied that you had seen me under other circumstances, in her it was, my dear friend, and in her features, that you saw mine. Now was the world a desert to me. I cared little, in the way of love, which way I turned. But in the way of hatred I cared everything. I transferred myself to the Russian service, with a view of gaining some appointment on the Polish frontier which might put it in my power to execute my vow of destroying all the magistrates of your city. War, however, raged and carried me into far other regions. It ceased, and there was little prospect that another generation would see it relighted, for the disturber of peace was a prisoner forever, and all nations were exhausted. Now then it became necessary that I should adopt some new mode for executing my vengeance, and the more so because annually some were dying of those whom it was my mission to punish. A voice ascended to me, day and night, from the graves of my father and mother, calling for vengeance before it should be too late. I took my measures thus. Many Jews were present at Waterloo. From among these, all irritated against Napoleon for the expectation he had raised. only to disappoint. By his great assembly of Jews at Paris, I selected 8, whom I knew familiarly as men hardened by military experience against the movements of pity. With these as my beagles, I hunted for some time in your forest before opening my regular campaign. And I am surprised that you did not hear of the death which met the executioner, him, I mean, who dared to lift his hand against my mother. This man I met by accident in the forest, and I slew him. I talked with the wretch, as a stranger at first, upon the memorable case of the Jewish lady. Had he relented, had he expressed compunction, I might have relented. But far otherwise. The dog, not dreaming to whom he spoke, exulted. But why repeat the villain's words? I cut him to pieces. Next I did this. My agents I caused to matriculate separately at the college. They assumed the college dress. And now mark the solution of that mystery which caused such perplexity. Simply as students we all had unsuspected admission to any house. Just then there was a common practice, as you will remember, among the younger students of going out a masking. That is, of entering houses in the academic dress, and with the face masked. This practice subsisted even during the most intense alarm from the murderers, for the dress of the students was supposed to bring protection along with it. But even after suspicion had connected itself with this dress, it was sufficient that I should appear unmasked at the head of the maskers to ensure them a friendly reception. Hence the facility with which death was inflicted, and that unaccountable absence of any motion toward an alarm. I took hold of my victim, and he looked at me with smiling security. Our weapons were hid under our academic robes, and even when we drew them out, and at the moment of applying them to the threat, they still supposed our gestures to be part of the pantomime we were performing. Did I relish this abuse of personal confidence in myself? No, I loathed it, and I grieved for its necessity. But my mother, a phantom not seen with bodily eyes, but ever present to my mind, continually ascended before me, and still I shouted aloud to my astounded victim, "This comes from the Jewess! Hound of hounds, do you remember the Jewess whom you dishonored, and the oaths which you broke in order that you might dishonor her, and the righteous law which you violated, and the cry of anguish from her son which you scoffed at?" Who I was, what I avenged, and whom, I made every man aware, and every woman, before I punished them. The details of the cases I need not repeat. One or two I was obliged, at the beginning, to commit to my Jews. The suspicion was thus, from the first, turned aside by the notoriety of my presence elsewhere. But I took care that none suffered who had not either been upon the guilty list of magistrates who condemned the mother, or of those who turned away with mockery from the supplications of the son. It pleased God, however, to place a mighty temptation in my path, which might have persuaded me to forego all thoughts of vengeance, to forget my vow, to forget the voices which invoked me from the grave. This was Margaret Liebenheim. Ah, how terrific appeared my duty of bloody retribution after her angel's face and angel's voice had calmed me. With respect to her grandfather, strange it is to mention that never did my innocent wife appear so lovely as precisely in the relation of granddaughter. So beautiful was her goodness to the old man, and so divine was the childlike innocence on her part, contrasted with the guilty recollections associated with him, for he was among the guiltiest toward my mother. Still I delayed his punishment to the last, and for his child's sake I would have pardoned him. Nay, I had resolved to do so, when a fierce Jew, who had a deep malignity toward this man, swore that he would accomplish his vengeance at all events, and perhaps might be obliged to include Margaret in the ruin, unless I adhered to the original scheme. Then I yielded, for circumstances armed this man with momentary power. but the night fixed on was one in which I had reason to know that my wife would be absent, for so I had myself arranged with her, and the unhappy counter arrangement I do not yet understand. Let me add that the sole purpose of my clandestine marriage was to sting her grandfather's mind with the belief that his family had been dishonored, even as he had dishonored mine. He learned, as I took care that he should, that his granddaughter carried about with her the promises of a mother, and did not know that she had the sanction of a wife. This discovery made him, in one day, become eager for the marriage he had previously opposed, and this discovery also embittered the misery of his death. At that moment I attempted to think only of my mother's wrongs, but, in spite of all I could do, this old man appeared to me in the light of Margaret's grandfather, and, had I been left to myself, he would have been saved. As it was, never was horror equal to mine when I met her flying to his succor. I had relied upon her absence, and the misery of that moment, when her eye fell upon me in the very act of seizing her grandfather, far transcended all else that I have suffered in these terrific scenes. She fainted in my arms, and I and another carried her upstairs and produced water. Meantime her grandfather had been murdered even while Margaret fainted. I had, however, under the fear of discovery, though never anticipating a re-encounter with herself, forestalled the explanation requisite in such a case to make my conduct intelligible. I had told her, under feigned names, the story of my mother and sisters. She knew their wrongs. She had heard me contend for the rights of vengeance. Consequently, in our parting interview, one word only was required to place myself in a new position to her thoughts. I needed only to say I was that son, that unhappy mother, so miserably degraded and outraged, was mine. As to the jailer, he was met by a party of us. Not suspecting that any of us could be connected with the family, he was led to talk of the most hideous details with regard to my poor Berenice. The child had not, as had been insinuated, aided her own degradation, but had nobly sustained the dignity of her sex and her family. Such advantages as the monster pretended to have gained over her, sick, desolate, and latterly delirious, were, by his own confession, not obtained without violence. This was too much. 40,000 lives, had he possessed them, could not have gratified my thirst for revenge. Yet, had he but showed courage, he should have died the death of a soldier. But the wretch showed cowardice the most abject, but you know his fate. Now then, all is finished, and human nature is avenged. Yet, if you complain of the bloodshed and the terror, think of the wrongs which created my rights. Think of the sacrifice by which I gave a tenfold strength to those rights. Think of the necessity of a dreadful shock and concussion to society in order to carry my lesson into the councils of princes. This will now have been effected, and ye, victims of dishonor, will be glorified in your deaths. You will not have suffered in vain, nor died without a monument. Sleep, therefore, sister Berenice, sleep, gentle Marianne, in peace. And thou, noble mother, let the outrages sown in thy dishonor rise again and blossom in white harvests of honor for the women of thy afflicted race. Sleep, daughters of Jerusalem, in the sanctity of your sufferings. And thou, if it be possible, even more beloved daughter of a Christian fold, whose company was too soon denied to him in life, open thy grave to receive him, who, in the hour of death, wishes to remember no title which he wore on earth, but that of thy chosen and adoring lover, Maximilian. End of section 11.